Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. Yes, I'm coming from the Sea of Galilee in the background. I wish. Uh, I'm here in the Oaks as always. Um, we are studying right now the apostles, and we're going to finish that up today, and we're going to look at the life of Paul. And if we have time, hopefully, we're going to look at some of the women in the Bible. Women are often overlooked in the Bible, and of course, that's because most history has been written by men, but that surely doesn't mean that women did not play a very important part in the Bible. In fact, I suspect they played a much larger role in the development of the early Christian church than we know. Um, but hopefully, we'll be able to get to some of those today. Last week, we looked at about 7 of the major apostles, and I call them major because the other 5, with the exception of Judas Iscari, are pretty obscure. We really don't know a whole lot about them. So we finished up last week, I believe, with Matthew. So let's look at Thomas today. Thomas is one of the obscure apostles. We really don't know very much about him at all. We're pretty sure that Thomas is an Aramaic name coming from Teoma, which means twin. And to further complicate that problem, he's also referred to as Didymus, which is Greek for twin. So we really don't even know for sure if Thomas was his name. It may have been, but there's no doubt that twin to somebody. There was speculation in the early church that he was twin brother of Jude the Apostle. That's a possibility. It's also a possibility that Jude the Apostle was the brother of Christ. So we really don't know for sure exactly who he was a twin to. No doubt, the thing that we most remember Thomas for is being doubting Thomas. If you'll recall that after the resurrection, the other apostles had seen him, and Thomas had not seen him, and he was really reluctant to embrace this. This was such a huge thing to his mind. And John tells us that he said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Well, Jesus did appear to him. And at that point, Thomas knew for sure that he had been resurrected. And then Jesus pronounced probably one of the most powerful statements of faith in the Bible. This is one of those passages I think is so important to our faith. It says, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. That was so important for the future of the Christian church because it wasn't easy to believe in Jesus' resurrection if you were there and saw it. But think how much more difficult for us as Christians to believe in the resurrection just purely on faith, and yet that's what we do. So, pretty powerful statement, and that surely wasn't anything derogatory towards Thomas. It's just that's the way it was. Now, for such an obscure apostle, we probably know more consistently about his death than anyone else. The tradition is really consistent about Thomas. Apparently, he went to India and did a missionary work in India. And they even have a date. They say on the 3rd of July, 72 AD, he was killed near Madras, India. Now, I've never been to India, but I have talked to Pastor Dwayne and a few other people that have been. And they say there is a huge Christian community near Madras, and that they trace their origins back to the 1st century. St. Thomas. This is the cathedral near a place called Chennai, India. And this is where his remains are supposedly buried. And that there is a really huge Christian population there with a lot of Christian names, as opposed to most of the rest of India, which of course is basically Hindu and some Muslim. Okay, James, son of Alphaeus. Boy, what an obscure apostle. He's only mentioned in the 4 list of the apostles. Everything else we know about James, son of Alphaeus, is pretty much speculation. Now, there were 4 Jameses in the Gospels. That complicates the problem. We know he was not James, the son of Zebedee. James and John were brothers, sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder. So we know he's not James of Zebedee. He's usually called James the Greater. And since their names appear in the list together and they had different fathers, it's obvious they were not the same 2 people. James the Lesser is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then there is the brother of Jesus named James. He's mentioned in Galatians and Acts. So there's 4 Jameses in the Gospels. James, son of Alphaeus, maybe James the Lesser. Possibly he could be the brother of Jesus. I personally don't believe that. I think he possibly could be James the Lesser. There was so much confusion, even the early church fathers had some problems with this. Jerome, one of the early church fathers, thought they were all the same person. That's obviously not the case. We know that Jesus had 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. And we know that James the Lesser had a brother named Joseph. So, but these were really common names in the biblical times. So that would have not been unusual. And then there's this problem. James's father was Alphaeus, which is also the name of Matthew's father. And that is not a common name. So is there a chance it could have been related to Matthew? There most certainly is. We really don't know very much about James, son of Alphaeus. All we know is he was one of the apostles that followed Jesus, one of the 12. With all this fusion, there's not very much out there, even in church tradition, about what happened to James, son of Alphaeus. It's almost certain he was martyred, because almost all the apostles except for John were martyred. If he was James, the brother of Jesus, shoved from the pinnacle of the temple and stoned to death. Some of the traditions in the early church said that he was crucified in Egypt. Again, folks, we just don't know. He is just a very obscure apostle, and he is confused with many other people in the Bible that it's difficult for us to put a good finger on exactly where he came from and what he did. Reportedly, to the church, his remains are buried in the Basilica de Santi Apostolo in Cathedral in Rome, along with Philip. But again, we don't know that for sure. And then there was Jude. Again, Jude is one of these obscure apostles whose name really confuses biblical scholars. In 2 Gospels, Jude, the son of James, appears to be referred to as Thaddeus. Now, Thaddeus certainly was a nickname, probably because after the events with Judas Iscariot, Jude did not want to be associated with that name, and they probably chose to call him Thaddeus up to that point. There is also, of course, the belief by some that Jude was the brother of Jesus. We know that Jesus had a brother by the name of Jude. And since the epistle of Jude is attributed to the brother of Jesus, it very well could be that the apostle Jude was his brother. The only problem with that is we know from John that his brothers, for the most part, did not follow Jesus during his ministry. We know that said no one wants to become a public figure, acts in secret. Since you're doing these things, show yourself to the world, for even his own brothers did not believe him. Obviously, after the resurrection, when he appeared to some of his brothers, particularly James, his brother, they changed their story. But while the apostles were following Jesus during the ministry, Jude was there. And so there's some problems with him, the brother of Jesus. But that is what a lot of people believe, and it very well could be. He also could be the son of Clopas and Mary of Clopas was the reported sister-in-law of Mary, the mother of Jesus. If that's the case, then Jesus and Jude would have been cousins. So again, these are one of these obscure apostles that we just know very little about, folks. We can't put our finger exactly on anything for sure about Jude the apostle. Tradition holds that Jude preached in Judea, Mesopotamia, and present-day Armenia. In fact, he was so in church that he, along with Bartholomew or Nathaniel, whichever one you want to call him, is just considered to be the founder of the early Armenian church. And again, we talked about the early Armenian church being so important to the history of the early church. And if that's the case, then he's buried in St. Peter's Basilica. At least that's the church's tradition. And then there's Simon the Zealot. Again, we know almost nothing about Simon the Zealot. His name appears in the list, and that's it. Everybody assumes that Simon the Zealot was a member of the military sect, which had been formed to try to drive out Roman occupiers. That's not necessarily for sure. He could have been zealous for Mosaic law. He could have been zealous for the teachings of Jesus. We just really don't know exactly anything about Simon the Zealot. We know, or at least there is tradition, that he at Cana when Jesus turned the water into the wine. And there's even some that say he was the brother of Jesus, Simon, one of his brothers. Again, that's not very well documented, so we don't know that for sure. The early church says that Simon preached in Mesopotamia and Egypt along with Jude, the brother of Jesus, and that he eventually was martyred. But he's martyred, according to the church, there's so many different versions of how he was martyred. Some say he was martyred in Spain. Some say he was martyred in Britain. And there's some that say he was martyred in Persia or Armenia. So we know very little about Simon. He's just a very obscure, apostle. Here is the church of Simon the Canaanite in Armenia, which is dedicated to Simon the Zealot. You will notice that many of the statues of Simon the Zealot in the church, he has a saw. That is because the tradition is that just like Isaiah in the Old Testament, when he was martyred, he was sawed in half. That was his way he was martyred. But many of the statues of Simon the Zealot portray him holding a saw. And then, of course, there's Judas Iscari. And we all know about Judas. Judas, of course, was the betrayer of Jesus, according to the Bible. John 12:4-6 clearly states he was the designated treasurer of the apostles' money, but he was a thief. We know that. He charged the money, and yet he was obviously stealing from it. And there's all sorts of traditions about him being perhaps a spy for the Roman government. But again, nobody knows. We know the story about Judas Iscariot because it's told in quite detail by the Gospels. Everyone's a little bit different. I've chosen to do Matthew's following story of the betrayal because Matthew, you think about it, Mark wrote his gospel from talking with Peter. Luke, although he was a great researcher and did probably talk to hundreds of eyewitnesses, still wasn't there. John wasn't so concerned about what Jesus did, but what he said. Matthew seems to be the gospel writer that was the eyewitness that wrote down the facts more than the other three gospels. So I've chosen his gospel to kind of follow what happened to Judas and Jesus. He says that Judas meets with the chief priest and agrees to betray Jesus. And then he says that Jesus while he was in the Garden of Gethsemane after the Last Supper praying, knowing that his time had arrived, that the disciples keep falling asleep. And remember, there's this incident where he goes 3 different times to try to wake them. And Judas finally arrives with a armed unit of soldiers, not Roman soldiers. These soldiers would have been attached to the Sanhedrin. It would have been Jewish, like an armed bodyguard type thing. And he points out Jesus by greeting him with a kiss. And then, of course, we know that not soon after that, Judas regrets his betrayal, tries to return the money according to Matthew, and that's the story of Judas Iscariot as far as his betrayal. 2 different versions about what happened to Judas. Matthew says, so Judas threw the money in the temple and left, and then he went away and hanged himself. That's what Matthew says. Luke's account differs somewhat in Acts. He says, with the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas brought a field, and there he fell headlong. His body burst open, and all of his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called that field in their language Akadama, that is, field of blood. And that is a photo of the reported field of blood where Judas Iscariot supposedly purchased and became, where he hung himself and died. So that's it for the apostles. Let's turn our attention to Paul. Now, we know probably more historical information about Paul than any other person mentioned in the New Testament, because Paul obviously wrote so many books in the New Testament. He wrote 13, possibly 14. We know a tremendous amount of a lot about him because he told us a lot about himself. We know that he was born in Tarsus, which is present-day southern Turkey, and he is as the 13th apostle. He converted to Christianity a few years after the conviction of Jesus, regarded as maybe the most important figure in the Apostolic Age after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. So we know a tremendous lot about Paul the Apostle. Hello. Paul, a Hebrew of the tribe of Benjamin, was born Saul. We think he was born somewhere around 5 AD and kept that name until he changed his name to Paul on the island of Cyprus, according to Acts. Paul was evidently born a Roman citizen. We know that. And he described himself as a Pharisee born of a Pharisee. So he was a Pharisee. And evidently, it appears that perhaps his father was a Pharisee. We know that he was trained in the leather crafting or tent making trade. So, again, we know these things about him by his own biography or in his books. While he was still young, he was sent to Jerusalem to receive an education at the school of Gamaliel. This was one of the great teachers of Jewish law. There were 2 schools of teaching in Jerusalem, and this was one of them. This was a school that basically taught the Jewish law from a very strict understanding. We know that he was literate in Aramaic. We know he knew Hebrew, obviously. We know he knew Greek and probably had a pretty much of a working knowledge of the world in him. We know that he often talked about Stoicism and metaphors of Stoicism and his ministry to the Gentiles. So he was a very intelligent man. And then he became a persecutor of the early Christian church. He himself said in Acts that he began to destroy the Christian church. He was present at the stoning of Stephen, who was the first martyr in the Christian church. Whether he actually participated in the stoning or was there just egging the crowd on, we don't know for sure. But we know this, after that, most of the Christians fled Jerusalem and went to Damascus. And he asked permission from the Sanhedrin to follow the Christians to Damascus and persecute them there. We know this again in Acts 9, verses 1 and 2. So Paul apparently started off to Damascus. This would have been about 35 AD or so. We know from his own books and from Acts that he had a vision of Jesus where he fell to the ground, heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he asked, who are you, Lord? And the reply came, I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting. Totally changed his life. He 3 days, and he was led to a house in Damascus, which was occupied by the name of Ananias, who was a Christian. And Ananias restored his sight, and it said in Acts that he was filled with the Holy Spirit. And at that point, he began a life dedicated to spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. He was as on fire for Jesus as he was on fire for persecuting the Christians in his church. And so he preached in the synagogue of Damascus, and then eventually went to Arabia, where we don't know exactly what he did, but he was there apparently for about 3 years. Most of the time spent in the desert. I would assume he meditating, learning about the early church. And so this is a painting of Simon and on the road to Damascus and his vision of Jesus. Well, Paul gets back. And so this would have been somewhere in the late 30s or so. He decides that he's going to go to Jerusalem. Now, Paul was exactly welcomed in Jerusalem, folks. The early Christian church, while they may have heard of Paul's conversion, would most certainly not have been welcoming of him, because he was one of the chief persecutors of the church after the resurrection. But he goes there, and according to Acts and Galatians with Peter and James, the other apostles wouldn't have anything to do with him. They were scared to meet with him. But he met with James and the brother of Jesus and Peter. And apparently they gave him their approval. He returned to Syria and Damascus in that area and southern Turkey, and began to preach to the Gentiles, because that was where he felt like his mission was. He returns to Tarsus, and then Barnabas, another early church follower, traveled with him, seeks him out, and they go to Antioch, where they established the first church there. And the Bible, of course, says it was at Antioch that the followers of Christ first called Christians. If you didn't know that, that's where Christians first became called that. According to Pastor Dwayne, it was kind of a derogatory term, and the early Christians took it on themselves, and they liked it. And so they became known as followers of Christ, Christians. About 42 AD, a big famine broke out in Jerusalem, and the citizens of Jerusalem, the Christian church followers, were really having a hard time. And so Paul and Barnabas, along with a young disciple called Titus, decided they're going to go to Jerusalem with a collection of money. They collected money around Antioch, which spiritually. And it was on this trip that, through the intervention of Barnabas, that Paul was accepted into the full church of Jerusalem and given the ministry to the Gentiles in the church. That's according to Galatians 2:1. So it was his second trip to Jerusalem where he is basically given the authority to preach to the Gentiles. And this occurred primarily through the intervention of Barnabas. Barnabas isn't mentioned a whole lot in the New Testament, but there's every indication that Barnabas was a key figure in the early church. In fact, there are a lot of biblical scholars that believe that the early church would not have grown as fast or as rapidly had it not been for Barnabas. Barnabas was a very key figure in the early church. Barnabas then accompanies Paul back to Antioch along with John Mark. John Mark is a follower of Peter, and he is the guy that writes the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. And Mark and Barnabas resumed their ministry to the Gentiles. This is according to the book of Acts. About 48 AD, Barnabas and John Mark and Paul begin a missionary trip. They go to Cyprus, and then they head out to present-day southern Turkey and return to Antioch. When they reported back to the church what had happened, it was on this trip that John Mark left in the middle of the trip. And from that point on, John Mark and Paul had a little bit of a falling out. We don't know what over. We don't know what had happened, but we know that John Mark left in the middle of the trip, and it somewhat angered Paul. Paul, you almost get this feeling that Paul was so passionate for Christ that he was also kind of intolerant. And as a result, perhaps he and John Mark just didn't get along, possibly a personality conflict there. 49 AD, Paul and Barnabas attend what's known as the Jerusalem Council. This is a huge event, folks. In 49 AD, approximately, Jerusalem decides that they're going to finally settle the issue of circumcision. Circumcision was a Jewish rite that had to be followed to be a part of the church. The question had arisen, do Gentiles have to be circumcised? Paul went there, attended the council, spoke to it along with Barnabas, and finally James, the brother of Jesus, who by this time was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, announced that Gentiles would not have to be circumcised in order to join the church. This is written in Acts 15, 1 through 39. It gives us kind of a detailed account of the Jerusalem Council and this big to-do over circumcision. And so Paul goes back and begins to minister to the Gentiles, so in them they did not have to be circumcised in order to join the church. With the conference over, Barnabas and Paul, accompanied by Judas, Barnabas, and Silas, another person that we will talk about here shortly, journeys back to Antioch to announce their decision. So, and then he begins his second journey. The first journey is here in green. And you can see it was kind of a short journey, basically in Cyprus and southern Turkey, and that was all. The second journey was quite a bit larger. It's in red. And you can see that he journeys up here to western Turkey and then crosses over to Corinth, goes to Athens, up through here, Thessalonica, Philippi, back to Turkey, and back over to Antioch. So it was quite a larger journey than his first journey was. This is the second missionary trip. Now, in 49 AD, about a year after the Jerusalem Council, Peter visits Antioch. And Peter goes to Antioch and he meets up with Paul. And then there's a big kerfuffle. There's a big to-do. Peter is apparently followed to Antioch by some of the followers of James. And, apparently some of these followers of James are once again preaching that in order to be into the church, you have to be circumcised. And it's here that Paul says in the book of Galatians that Peter kind of starts to backtrack. And that gets into a big incident. It's called the incident at Antioch, where according to Paul, he pretty much rebukes Peter pretty strongly. He says, Peter, you are a Jew, yet you live as a Gentile and not like a Jew. how is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? And it's a huge thing. It's also a message of justification by faith, which became really a cornerstone in the Reformation era under Martin Luther. Paul says, we who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Now, none of this is recorded in Acts. It's only in the book of Galatians written by Paul that we know of this incident at Antioch. But it's a really big kind of incident between Peter and Paul about this circumcision. This was a big thing that just kept going in the early church for a while. About 50 AD, he makes his second missionary journey that we talked about. And Paul and Barnabas apparently got into an argument about taking John Mark. Barnabas and John Mark were probably cousins. And Barnabas wanted to take John Mark. And, Paul just absolutely refused to do it because he felt like John Mark had left him in the middle of the first journey. And so Barnabas takes off by himself along with John Mark, and they go to Cyprus. Paul then takes Silas and also picks up Timothy at Lystra, and they continue on to Greece. And they spend about 2 years in Greece ministering to the Gentiles. So this is what happens to Paul on his second thing. It's there that he meets a couple, Priscilla and Aquila, and they return to Ephesus with Paul, and they spend quite a bit of time at Ephesus. And then Paul goes on from there and travels through Macedonia and Greece and returns to Jerusalem in 57 AD. Priscilla and Aquila are a very important part also of the early church. It's very important that Priscilla's name precedes her husband's name. That is extremely unusual, folks. It's tradition shows you that whoever is named first is generally considered to be the leader. And since Priscilla, the woman, is actually named before her husband, this leads you to believe that she played a very important part in this church development. And she most certainly does. Paul returns to Jerusalem about 57 AD, and it's here that he causes a riot. Okay. If you remember the story in the book of Acts, he is accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple grounds. Remember, there were warning signs that Gentiles would not be let in to any of these places within the inner sanctum of the temple, the inner courtyard. And the story was that supposedly he did this. He denied it, and he appeared before the Roman officials there, and he basically told them, no, that's not the case. I didn't do it. And then he tells them, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen, and I want to appeal my case to the emperor. Boy, this throws the Romans into a quagmire because they don't know what to do. They didn't realize he was a Roman citizen. But to be a Roman citizen, it was kind of sacrosanct. So they take him to Felix in Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the Sea, where he was placed in house arrest for 2 years, waiting the outcome of Felix's trial. Felix is replaced during this time by Festus. And so Festus finally brings him before his court, along with King Herod Agrippa. And Paul pleads his case. And at the end, he basically says, I want to appeal my case to Caesar. I think that I have a right to go to Caesar. In the book of Acts, it quotes Agrippa telling Festus, the Roman procurator, this man could have been set free had he not appealed to Caesar. Had Paul not appealed his case to Caesar, he probably would have been set free because he really didn't break any law. Folks, this was what Paul wanted. Paul wanted to go to Rome. he wanted to take his case to Rome so he could preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Romans. And so Paul sets off on his third trip. Paul departs for Rome aboard a ship. He sailed to southern Turkey, and then he sails to Crete. Remember, this is where they have the big shipwreck, and this is the incident of the snake where he sticks his hand into the campfire of the wood, gets bit by a serpent, and he's not hurt. During the shipwreck, all the people are saved. A lot of miraculous thing happens on this third journey. Finally, they arrive in Rome about 60 AD. While he's there, he is again placed under house arrest, and he's really treated very gently. He's allowed to have visitors. He's got a Roman guard, but he preaches the gospel. He meets with Jewish leaders. He really has a pretty easy time of it. Finally, he is released from prison because there really wasn't anything to keep him. So in 62 AD, approximately, he's released from prison and he sets out to continue his missionary work. Now, there is a lot of dispute about what happened because we don't know anything that happened after this. This is where basically the book of Acts stops. And Paul really doesn't make mention of what he does during this third, after he is released from prison in Rome. Church tradition says he went to Spain. We can't prove that, but there's several early church writers, Clement, John Chrysostom, Cyril of Jerusalem, all of them say he went to Spain. We don't know. He may have, maybe didn't. We just know that he was free for a few years. But then about 2 years later, when the Neronian persecutions broke out under Nero, he was rearrested. I'm sure Nero was trying to arrest as many of the leaders of the church as he could find, and Paul was a very well-known leader of the church. So Paul was rearrested. He was in Turkey at the time, brought back to Rome, and this time he was imprisoned in the Mamertine prison. This was a very harsh prison. He was still able to meet with some of his followers. We know that he wrote letters. This is when he writes his second letter to Timothy, where he basically says that he knows his time is at an end. And that's kind of it. That's what the last we know. Now, Eusebius, the church historian, says that Paul was martyred approximately the same time as Peter, about 64 to 68 AD. Remember, Peter was supposedly crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified the same way as Jesus. Paul, being a Roman citizen, would not have been crucified. He would have been beheaded. That was considered to be a much more humane thing and pretty well instantaneous. So Paul was probably beheaded, and that's what church tradition. But boy, what a giant figure in the early church. Wrote at least 14 books. Many people think he wrote the book of Hebrews, but we aren't for sure about that. Some people think Barnabas may have written it. Some people think Apollos may have written it. Apollos is another one of the early church followers. This is reportedly Paul's cell at the Church of Mamertine, the prison at Mamertine in Rome. And it's now a shrine, obviously. So there were other important apostles, and I want to mention them real rapidly here. John Mark. John Mark, again, is primarily considered to be the author of the book of Gospel Mark, and it's almost universally accepted that it is Peter's account of Jesus. Many people think it was the first book written. John would have been his Hebrew name. Mark would have been his Greek name. We're almost sure that John Mark was pretty wealthy because remember, it was to his mother's house that Peter fled after he was miraculously released from prison. The accounts in Acts there. We know that Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas on his first missionary trip, but left in the middle of it. Again, we don't know why. There is even speculation. You remember the story in the Garden of Gethsemane where they say that a young man fled naked. He had his robe ripped off of him, and he fled naked when they came to arrest Jesus. There's a lot of early biblical scholars that think that was John Mark. I have no idea. There's nowhere in the Bible that says that. That's just what some of the early biblical scholars claim. And then there was James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just, as he's often called. He became the real leader of the early Christian church in Jerusalem. He became a follower of Jesus after his resurrection, and he witnessed the ascension. Jesus appeared to him, and he became a really large figure in the early church. Tradition says that James was thrown from the temple and beaten with the club somewhere around 62 AD. So we know pretty much that he was martyred for the church. There were some other disciples. Matthias, remember, Matthias is the one that took the place of Judas Iscariot. They cast lots. The early apostles, the other 11 apostles, cast lots to see whether it would be him or a man by the name of Joseph Barnabas. And Matthias won. That's about all we know about him. Tradition, again, church tradition says that he was martyred in modern day Georgia near the Caspian Sea, about 80 AD. But again, we don't know that for sure. And then there was Barnabas. I've talked about Barnabas a lot here. Barnabas was really an important figure in the early church. And he undertook some missionary journeys with Paul. He was kind of the bridge between the two factions of the early church, the Judaizers, those that believed you had to follow the law of the Jews to be a follower of Christ, and between the Gentiles. He was kind of the figure that kind of was able to breach the divide between these two factions of the early Christian church. Again, a lot of people think that if it had not been for him, the church may not have got off ground as rapidly as it did. So we don't know that. This is, by the way, the church at St. Barnabas in Cyprus, where he supposedly is buried and where he was martyred. There were some other figures. Silas, also known as Silvanus. He was the leading member of the early Christian church. He accompanied Paul on his second trip. Tradition says he was martyred in Macedonia around the late 60s. There was Timothy, to whom the book of Timothy, letters of Timothy were written. He was the son of a Jewish mother who was a Christian, and so was his grandmother, Lois. He's generally considered to be the first bishop of Ephesus. Very important person to Paul. Paul says, I have no one like him. Paul and Timothy were extremely close. And then there was Philip the Evangelist, not Philip the Apostle. Philip the Apostle is different from Philip the Evangelist. Philip the Evangelist was one of the 7 deacons chosen by the apostles to take care of the Christian community in Jerusalem. And then he begins to go out and missionize. He's the one, according to the book of Acts, that baptized the Ethiopian on the road to Gaza. And then it mentions in the book of Acts that he, along with his 4 daughters, who were all prophets, was visited by Paul. And so again, Philip the Evangelist and Philip the Apostle are 2 different people in the Bible. Then there's Luke, and we got to finish up here. I'm running a little behind. Luke, of course, is the writer of the book of the Gospel of Luke, as well as the book of Acts. He was most certainly a physician. This is written in Colossians. And while Luke wasn't an eyewitness, he obviously interviewed a lot of people, and he knew what he was talking about. The book, the Gospel of Luke, is a very factual-oriented book. Again, tradition says he died pretty late, around 90 AD. in Thebes or Greece. And then there was Apollos. Again, some people think Apollos wrote the book of Hebrews. Most people attribute it to Paul, but some people say no, it was Barnabas. Some people say no, it was Apollos. We don't know for sure. We just know that he was a student of Priscilla and Aquila, and that he became a very strong follower of Jesus and a very important figure in the early church. And this is Luke's coffin, his sarcophagus in Padua, Italy, where he supposedly is buried. Okay, I'm going to have to finish. I'm not going to get to the women today. We'll talk about the women the beginning next week. And then we're going to talk about some of the early Christian followers after the apostles are gone, something called the Apostolic Age. We're going to have to talk about some of the people that kept the church going after all the apostles died. So I thank you for being with me. I know you've given you a lot of information today, but I wanted to get through this as much as possible. And like I said, we'll talk about the women the first part of next week, and then we'll start talking about some of the early followers. So thank you for being with me. I hope you've learned something, and be glad to answer any questions. If you want to text me or email me or something like that, I'm sure Rachel or Kaylin would give you my address, and feel free to do that. Okay. Sorry I ran a little bit late, Kaylin.
Thank you, Tony.
Okay. We'll see you.